Joaquim Neto is Vice President of Healthcare at Verato. He has decades of experience in information management and master data management technologies across industries, with a particular expertise in healthcare and in master patient index and health information exchange solutions. Prior to Verato, Joaquim worked at Initiate Systems and IBM. Joaquim, take it away.
All right, thanks, Nick. Thanks everyone for joining us today for this brief but hopefully formative webinar. As Nick mentioned, we're going to just talk through some of the missed expectations that we see happen with traditional MPIs, things that basically increase the total cost of ownership of these solutions over time, and then we'll talk a little bit about how Verato does some things differently to avoid some of those pitfalls. So just a little background on the perspective we have and on this, as Nick mentioned, I myself spent quite a bit of time in the MPI space and around the MPI space and HIE and healthcare analytics. A lot of other folks here at Verato have similar experiences working on implementations with MPI implementations with providers, with payers, with HIEs, really across the healthcare ecosystem. And through that experience, we've observed a lot about what clients' expectations are of their traditional MPI installations, and then how those things pan out over time. So some of this information comes from those experiences, and some comes from the experiences here at Verato. We work with a lot of clients who, some have never had an MPI before, and we work with them from the start. Others have invested in other MPI technologies over time, and we're coming in and basically trying to help address some of these problems that exist. So that's what informs the content for today. What we'll cover is these three sort of major issues we've identified. So the first is the idea of tuning. So in order to get accurate patient identification results out of an MPI, the traditional systems require a fair amount of configuration and tuning. And that often ends up being a sort of a higher burden and higher cost than organizations realize when they start to implement MPI for the first time. The second piece is data stewardship. Data stewardship is a key element of an MPI program. And oftentimes, organizations don't understand sort of the degree to which, or the amount of data stewardship they're going to have to do on top of what the MPI technology is doing on its own. So we want to talk through that a little bit. And then the last is a point that you see with many enterprise software applications, which is on-premise installations of complicated technology. Often require upgrades every few years, technology improvements, releases from vendors, and that's another thing that can become a very sort of costly and distracting activity that has a big impact on the TCO for your MPI program. So let's get right into it and start with this tuning idea. So the reason that MPIs need to be tuned is because the fact of the matter is that the data that you're processing when you're trying to rationalize patient records is not of the highest quality. This is probably not news to anyone who's looking into making an MPI purchase or investing in MPI related programs. But the data that we see coming out of EMRs inherently has problems with it. So most folks are highly aware and think of the types of data entry errors that happen during the registration process. So you're registering a patient and people make typos in names and they misspell addresses, things like that. There's also a prevalence for missing data. So different facilities have different EMRs, they capture different types of information. Sometimes certain data elements are required. Maybe some organizations are required to capture a social security number, others do not. There's these varieties in how much data you get about your patients as you're registering them. And those are the things people traditionally think of and understand as being data quality issues that need to be handled by your MPI in order to get patient identification right. But there's also some other types of issues with data, and some of it isn't a problem with the data, it's just the fact that data changes over time. So people move and they change their addresses. 12 to 15% of people move every year. People get married and they change their name. Oftentimes when that happens, they're changing their address at the same time. So these are changes in data. It's data getting old and out of date. It's not necessarily a mistake on anyone's part, but it's just a fact of life with how data changes. All these things make it very difficult to match patient records. And as a result, you have to invest a lot in traditional MPIs to get the algorithms tuned to account for all of those errors. So the way people do that is typically through several months worth of requirements definition, coming up with the rule sets that you are going to implement for what constitutes a matching record or not a matching record. Sometimes these are, cascading rules that have 10, 15, 20 criteria that you cycle in and out of. Some of the more sophisticated MPIs rely on probabilistic weighting. So implementation teams will come in and actually set the weights for certain attributes. How much is one last name worth versus another last name worth, and that'll be based on the data that's within your system, which sounds like a great idea, but it's highly effort intensive, and it takes a lot longer than people typically think. It's one of the reasons that MPI implementations take months and months and months is this configurability and tuning of algorithms takes time. And you have to get buy-in. So as you're customizing these rules, you have to make sure you're getting them right. And so it involves data experts from health information management, other data analysts and stakeholders have to review all of these changes and basically get buy-in to make sure that you're getting the most accurate results you can. So that's an expensive process. The issue that sort of compounds that is that today we're seeing more and more requirements for integrating new data. So whether it's adding additional data sources to your MPI, either because you're integrating another facility, organizations are, there's mergers and acquisitions of healthcare organizations that necessitate combining data sources into one MPI. There's a lot more information exchange going on between organizations. And then you have new applications that are sitting on top of your MPI and your EMRs. So population health applications or consumer-facing applications. These things may or may not be adding data to the MPI, but they are changing the way the data is consumed. And all of this activity basically triggers retuning exercises. So as the data that you're running changes, the approach with traditional MPIs is to tune the system to operate against that data. So you end up in this cycle where you're constantly tuning and retuning the system. We see a lot of clients who expect that to have been a one-time exercise, and then lo and behold, they're spending even a couple $100,000 every few years to retune because their MPI system is growing or adding new data sources or taking on new use cases. So this is kind of the first big bogey that's out there that we wanted to talk about. So the next is this data stewardship idea. And most of the folks that are here today that, like I said, either have an MPI or are looking into them understand how this works. But basically, as you load data in traditional MPI, what happens is if you get a very high confidence match against an existing patient record, then the system determines that the two records are represented by the same person. They link the MRNs together or merge them, and you're good to go. If you get a new patient record and it clearly doesn't match to any of the existing patients you have inside of your system, then it assigns a new ID and you go on your happy way. And then there's this middle category where the result is ambiguous. The MPI matches an incoming record. It looks a lot like an existing record you have, but it's not exactly the same. So it falls into this gray area and creates a work list item or a data stewardship task. And that's what your HIM team or your stewardship team can then go in and manually make decisions on. And that's great. It's a great feature to have. It helps you get to a higher degree of accuracy the more effort you put in. So all good on the face of it. The problem is the amount of stewardship that you have to do. So Organizations often, even select an MPI based on, their experience with the user interface of the stewardship application. Hey, which one of these things is going to be the best one to use? Is going to make us the most productive? And that's great until you're faced with hundreds of thousands of tasks. And that's what we see happen very often is the size of this gray area, the size of these work lists often ends up being much bigger than organizations think they're going to be. You think when you go to implement an MPI that 90% of the work is going to be done for you automatically. And what ends up happening is that maybe 30% of the resolutions end up in this queue. And it just gets to be way bigger than you have resources to manage. So one example from a client of ours, San Diego Health Connect, implemented MPI. As soon as they got their first few major data sources loaded, we're looking at nearly 200,000 tasks. And they'd put estimates together that their team, even if they grew it to a size of 4 full-time employees, was going to take years to resolve. And that's just often, is not viable. So with stewardship, this is another one of these items that it's a part of everyone's program. And typically organizations will estimate into their, total cost of ownership, what's the cost of the data steward, and they assume some minimal level of stewardship that'll be required. What we end up seeing is that oftentimes those allocations of data stewards to the program just aren't nearly high enough. We usually see organizations need a couple data stewards for every 1 million patients they're managing, but most HIM teams are understaffed compared to that. And it's just because of some missed expectations on how much work there's going to be around this stewardship idea. So the last category that I mentioned before is this upgrade idea. So like all enterprise software, you install the software, you put it on certain hardware that you've acquired, you install prerequisites, you do all those things, and that cost is typically estimated pretty well upfront from organizations that are purchasing an MPI. It's easy to figure out what the hardware costs are going to be and the implementation estimates and things like that. But the piece that is often overlooked is that vendors release new versions of software every couple of years, or more often than that. And some of these things have features that you would want to take if you're licensed to this software, things you want to take advantage of. There's often times where the MPI vendors will basically force their customers to upgrade. If you are on a release that's somewhat old, or if there's some critical issue, organizations can be, forced into this path of doing this upgrade project, which oftentimes, is not a seamless affair. Sometimes upgrading the MPI, which is, a fairly complex system, can cost almost as much as it takes to implement, or at least a significant fraction of that. So we see this upgrade being another one of these issues that catches clients by surprise. After just a few years of operating, all of a sudden they're faced with another implementation around this upgrade event. It requires outside resources to help. Even if a bulk of the work can be done with internal resources, it becomes just a very disruptive event that affects the operations and ends up costing real money one way or another. And it's not a one-time thing either. It's an ongoing thing that happens every few years, as is the case with most kind of traditional software products. So what's the result of these three things? Is when you're creating your estimates for what you have to invest in an MPI program. If you're looking at traditional MPI software, people, obviously the license cost of the software is on everyone's radar. People know there's going to be implementation, and so you factor in some amount of implementation. Oftentimes those estimates are a little bit low, just because of the complexity involved with all of these steps in the process, but at least the line item's there. Maintenance and support for licensed software, it's 20% of the license or whatever, people bake that into their estimates. And like I mentioned before, hardware is usually fairly well accounted for these days. Sometimes that might include hosting if you are having a a cloud vendor host your traditional MPI software, that would be a part of that. But it's these last three that we see getting missed. This ongoing tuning expense, the data stewardship being much more resource intensive than people think, and then this periodic disruptive upgrade idea. These are all things that should be estimated into the lifetime cost of an MPI, so you don't have any surprises. So what does that end up looking like? We put together some estimates, and I'll tell you at the end, we've got a little calculator that we've created that's pretty cool, to try to capture some of these elements. And what we're building up to, which I'm gonna get to in a second, is how the Verato UMPI, Universal MPI offering, differs from this. It's a subscription-based solution, so I'll contrast that with here a little bit. But this just gives you kind of a visual for what that TCO looks like over, in this case, a 4-year period. So year one, there's a big major cost for acquisition of the MPI license. The implementation is a big chunk, actually probably bigger really than shows up here on this chart here on the left. And there's those initial costs, and people usually do a good job. Organizations do a pretty good job of estimating what that year one cost is going to be. But then over time, have a tendency to think that they've already, you purchased the software and therefore your expense is done. And that's what ends up not being the case. So in addition to the maintenance and support, you have this higher load of data stewardship. That's the yellow box that, continues on forever. And then you have these periodic events, these additional tuning exercises that come into play, the upgrades every few years. And if you look at that over the long term, then what ends up happening is your, total cost maybe twice what you thought it was going to be, just because you weren't if you're not accounting for these other factors that often get overlooked. So that's the idea, so that's the idea with the traditional MPI approach. So what do we have to say that's different from that? So the Verato Universal MPI is it's a new MPI. We've been around we started in 2012 as a company, and we launched our UMPI to the beginning of this year. And it's a fundamentally different approach to both the approach and then also the technology that it's built on. So what we do is we start with basically a system that has records of all the patients in the US. So we have a reference database that has demographic information on US persons. It's a very robust and high quality set of data. So going back to the very beginning of this discussion today, when we were talking about the problems that we see inside of EMR data, the data quality issues that exist, and how those are kind of the big impediment to getting good accuracy with traditional MPI approaches, we're attacking that by bringing in high quality data to the equation. So basically what we have is we have longitudinal demographic profiles, address histories, name changes for people, a very comprehensive set of data. So we nearly always have the name and the address and the date of birth and the social security number, and across the board, all of those attributes that you need to identify someone. And because we have that high quality data, we can match the lower quality EMR data just based on the merits of having the data itself. So from an accuracy perspective, we can get very accurate results, and we don't have to go through these exercises of trying to tune to some very specific characteristics of the data. Basically, we're tuned to this national population that we have in our database already. So that approach, not only makes it more accurate, but it also makes it much simpler and faster to implement, and gets you out of this ongoing tuning business. So that's really the idea with our approach. To give you a little more information on that, this reference database that we have, we build it out of multiple data sources. We handpick sort of the places we get that data from to provide different characteristics. So we get data from credit header data, which has some really good high quality characteristics about it. We combine that with utility type information, which has very good, is kept up to date, is very recent. If you move and change your address, you're also going to change your, the location for getting your phone and your electric bills. And so the knowledge of movements and where people live and things like that is very current with that. So anyway, we go out and we combine all this data and we've created this high quality data asset. And that's what we use to get very accurate results with a very different approach to configuration that doesn't take all of that effort you see with a traditional approach. So to kind of visualize how that works, what we're doing is, if you look at this example, you've got a medical record on the left from facility A, Catherine Smith, 123 Main Street. You have another medical record, let's say the record on the left, Catherine Smith presented at, Hospital 1, 6 months ago. And then Kathy Johnson comes and presents at Hospital 2. She provides her name, Kathy Johnson, her current address of Elm Road, and phone number. If you were to look at those two records using a traditional MPI approach, which is just comparing those directly, they really look nothing like each other. There's nothing that would lead you to believe that the Catherine Smith on the left is the Kathy Johnson on the right. However, if you look at it with the benefit of having our reference database accessible, you'll see that, oh, Catherine Smith changed her name. She was Catherine Smith, and now she's Kathy Johnson. And at the same time, she also moved from 123 Main Street to 456 Elm Road. And then we have all of the other demographics on file as well. So we have the date of birth that she provided in the one setting. We have the phone number she provided in the other setting. And by having all that, it basically becomes an easy to resolve identity question. And that's the power of the reference database. And because we're doing that techniques, it's a much simpler system to operate. And like I said before, gives you the results you need. So you get out of the business of either ongoing tuning or doing periodic cleanups, which is something that we didn't talk about. That's actually that wasn't in our list of these top 3 concerns to be aware of, but it is something to think about. Many organizations that end up with these misset expectations on how much stewardship is going to be required if they only have 2 or 3 stewards, but the need is 5 or 6 stewards. What ends up happening is you sort of build up this data quality issue backlog, and then periodically you have to go out and hire someone to come in and clean it up. And that's, again, costly activity that can be avoided if you use a different approach like Verato is offering. So if we go back to the TCO and just how that looks, I mentioned before, and I'm not getting into a lot of details today about Verato and what we're offering, but just enough to kind of contrast it. So, we are a true SaaS platform. You have an annual subscription. That with whatever minimal data stewardship you have, we don't claim to eliminate data stewardship 100%, but the way our referential matching system works lets you take a huge chunk out of that manual effort. And so you have a much smaller slice of manual activity and one that's actually manageable. And really those are your only costs. It's your subscription and then this, minimal level of stewardship you need. And if you look at how that translates over time compared to the traditional approach, once you're accounting for everything, all these sort of hidden factors in the traditional MPI, the ROI is really there. And you tend to see pretty good, a very stark comparison in total cost of ownership, as long as you're counting all of these factors that are out there. So this just kind of summarizes the reasons, right? There's the fast implementation. It's a much simpler solution than traditional approaches. You obviously skip all of the steps around, just the base implementation activities of installing software and so forth. But there's a lot of things that are in that bucket. So if you think about simple scalability, performance issues, things like that, if you have a reasonably sized MPI implementation, those things themselves could be a 2 or 3 month project to get your database and your application server and all that tuned to be able to meet the needs you have. With the cloud offering we have, it just happens out of the box. We manage that, and those are, again, additional costs that you simply don't incur by going with this next generation approach. So To give you a feel for that, like I mentioned before, we've created this calculator, and it factors in, it's pretty cool, it factors in lots of different typical characteristics of the profiles of different types of organizations that are looking for MPI. So, whether you're a provider or payer, the number of patients you have, the number of different EMRs you're using, whether you do stewardship today and sort of how big your staff is. It sort of takes all of those inputs and comes out with a model for what your savings would be. So if I can back up to my slide here, basically what it ends up calculating for you is this difference between the the Verato approach, the SaaS, true SaaS universal MPI approach versus the traditional on-prem approach, and what would the savings be over, I think it's 4 years that we do that. So basically the same kind of information you see here today. So you can go out there, get back to that. You can go out there and play around with that, get some stats for your organization. And then of course, we'd love to talk to you more about Verato and other ways to get started if you're interested.
Great. Thank you so much, Joaquin, for that presentation. I see we do have a few questions that came in here, but most of them are pretty specific to each person's individual situation. So I think what we'll end up doing is just reach out to those of you who ask questions individually to answer your questions once this webinar is over. So with that just about does it for today. We'll send out an email with the webinar recording, and also we'll include the link to our TCO calculator in that email so you can head over there and play around with it and figure out what your TCO difference would be if you were using Verato. With that, thank you all for joining, and have a wonderful rest of your day.